Welcome to the Tourpreneur podcast. Travel industry veteran Shane Whaley will take you on a journey with fellow tourpreneurs, sharing their tips, ideas, insights, and success stories to inspire you to make your tour business the best it can be. And now, please welcome your host, Shane.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Tourpreneur, the podcast for all of us that work in tours, activities, and experiences. Today we're talking with Mike Brown, the man behind the Pleasing Terrors Ghost Tours in Charleston. Mike has just celebrated his 10th year in business, and we're delighted that he agreed to come on the show and share his wisdom, knowledge, and experience with us. He talks us through the early days of setting up his tour, why reviews keep him awake at night, gives us tips on how we should work with our competitors, tells us about the licensing exam and the test that he took in Charleston, how he markets his tours, how he trains his tour guides, and even how he created a podcast to promote his tours. As always, you can find links and resources mentioned in this episode at www.tourpreneur.com, and don't forget whilst you're there to sign up for my curated Tourpreneur Daily Briefing, where I sum up all the major industry news, as well as the latest career opportunities and people news. Now, let's cross over to Mike Brown. Welcome to Tourpreneur. Mike, how are you?
Fine. Thank you for having me on your show.
I'm excited to talk to you because I know very little about ghost tours, right? I'm a real scaredy cat. I don't even like horror movies, whereas ghost tours are incredibly popular. I know that from my time working in an OTA. So can you share a little bit more with us about the Pleasing Terrors Ghost Tour, which is a part of Old Charleston walking tours?
Well, it's a 90-minute walking tour, and I give tours in Charleston, South Carolina. And the tour is a nighttime tour that visits haunted sites around our historic district, mostly around what we call the French Quarter. And the tour is a mixture of ghost stories and history. And I've been doing it for 21 years now. So I really enjoy it.
Absolutely. So if I was to come to Charleston and I was to go on to the tour, what kind of things where would you take me?
Well, we visit a haunted restaurant, a haunted library. We go by several graveyards. We go down some creepy alleyways. So there's quite a few locations.
So I'm curious to know, because first of all, I have to thank you for your service. I understand that you served in the U.S. Navy.
Oh, yeah, long time ago.
So how did you get from being in the U.S. Navy to today running your own ghost tours?
Well, while I was in the Navy, I developed an interest in history. And after I got out, I moved back home to Charleston, South Carolina. And one day I decided I wanted to go on a historic tour downtown just for fun. And afterwards, I realized that seems like a really fun job and something that I'd like to do. And initially, it was just going to be sort of a weekend fun job. But over time, it sort of became my real job.
Sure. And at what point was it that you realized that, you have a passion for this, that you really enjoy giving a tour?
I think early on, I found that I really enjoyed the storytelling aspect of being a tour guide. Even today, that's the part of it that I like the most. And that I found early on that I enjoyed doing that when I was just giving history tours. But the storytelling aspect is even more prominent with ghost tours. And that's really what's kind of drawn me into ghost tours and kept me giving ghost tours for all these years.
And how did you feel starting your own business, starting your own tours?
Well, when I first started giving ghost tours, I worked for 2 different companies over a period of about 8 years. And the second company that I worked for, it was one of these situations where I learned one day sort of through the grapevine that the company was getting ready to go out of business. And I sort of had to figure out, well, what am I going to do now? So I got together with one of the other people that work there, and we formed our own company and just decided to run with it. We kind of had no choice. It was sort of a thrust on us, the idea of, okay, well, we got to do this on our own.
Did you have any voices in your head that were saying, come on, Mike, who are you playing at?
Oh, I still have them. 10 years. I just celebrated the company's 10-year anniversary, and I still have those voices.
Well, congratulations, first of all. 10 years in travel is a worthy milestone, sir. In terms of those voices, how do you quieten them down? How do you overcome them?
It's just, and I think this is true with any business. There's a lot of nights of laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, worrying about things. I can't, to some extent, I can't help that. I've just sort of learned to deal with it. But I think it's just a question of making sure that you've taken care of, the basics of running the business. And that's really all you can do, especially with a travel or tourism related business. There's so many uncertainties baked into it. Everything from what the weather is going to be, are we going to have a hurricane this year? Is it going to snow? Those kinds of things. I mean, a storm like that can knock our business out for a week or more. And then there's other, new competitors coming in, and, is what I'm doing my marketing strategy online, is that working or is it not? I mean, there's a lot of things to worry about.
And have you, or at the start or any time since really, received any advice from anyone that been indispensable to you?
I have. I've had people that I've had the benefit of being able to talk to over the years. I would say that have been able to help me with specific problems, particularly. One kind of unusual thing, I think, in business in general, and certainly in the tourism business, is that I have a pretty close relationship with one of my competitors. And so there have been occasions where I've been able to go to them and say, well, what do you recommend that I do in this particular situation? And they would offer me advice. And then when they would have a problem that I could help with, I would help them with it. So it's that's worked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced that myself. When I worked for an OTA, I worked at Get Your Guide for a couple of years as their regional director for the Americas. And I saw that with my own eyes, how tour companies were helping each other out, even competing ones. And I've said this on the show before, I was kind of shocked because that rarely happens in the hotel industry. Maybe when there's overbookings or something has happened, they'll help each other out. But I was really kind of surprised to see it. And also I was talking to Douglas Quinby, who's the founder of the Arrival event. He was saying the same thing, that he sees in our space, in our sector, that the industry is more like a big family that wants to help each other out. But nonetheless, I think people who want to be tourpreneurs and they're listening to the show and they're plotting and they're planning to launch their tour would also be quite surprised about the landscape and how companies can be quite helpful when starting out. And I think that says a lot for our industry, right, Mike? It's a great place to work.
Well, it is. And I think a lot of times it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but you get back what you put into it. So if you go into the marketplace with your competitors and you're positive and you're helpful, then I think a lot of times they will be inclined to return the favor. Whereas if you're hostile and a negative presence, then you're going to be treated as such. For example, with one of the things that I've done is offer lectures on how to tell ghost stories so that other tour guides, people that I'm competing against, can hear, okay, well, this is how I tell ghost stories, and here's some ideas that you can use to improve your tour. And on the surface, that might seem foolish for me to help my competitors improve the tours that they're offering. But what I've found is that even though it's counterintuitive, by doing that and by having that sort of presence in the tourism space in Charleston, that whenever I've needed things, other people have been willing to step forward to help me, whether it was offering me access to a location that I didn't have access to, for example, for the podcast, or whether it was on one occasion when last year in April, I was in a pretty serious car accident, and I was able to call one of my competitors, and they stepped in and took over my tours for me and gave my tours for me to make sure that there was still a tour guide there to meet the customers and that I didn't have to cancel. So I've really enjoyed embracing sort of a constructive environment, even with the people I'm competing against.
Yeah, I think there's very few industries like this. Most industries I've worked in have been quite cutthroat, to be honest. So I'm smiling here when I'm hearing you say this. And you're so right. The tourpreneurs who do give back, who do support. And actually, even with this show, folks who come on the show like yourself, you're not here to sell anything right now because we're not a consumer podcast, right? I mean, I would like to think that fellow tourpreneurs listening, when they're in Charleston, will say, hey, that Mike Brown sounded a good guy. I want to go on his ghost tour and we will get some business. But tourpreneurs are coming on to share because, I think it's a case we all want to be successful and help each other be successful. What were some of the, when you were starting out, what do you think were some of the biggest challenges you had down there in Charleston? Is there anything around insurance or legal setup? I did read the other day, and I don't know if this applies to you, Mike, that there was a federal judge who pushed back on Charleston's mandatory licensing for tour guides. Did anything like that affect you at all?
No, not really. I've had a license since 1995, I think. But the licensing here in Charleston is in a legal limbo right now because federal court has ruled that it's unconstitutional. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. But that kind of thing wasn't really an issue. I think the biggest problem that I've had was with training and keeping employees, getting employees to the point where they could do a good job telling ghost stories. And then if I could get them to that point, getting them to continue working for me and not leaving to go somewhere else. That's been the biggest problem.
Huge challenge. We're going to dig into a bit about management shortly. In terms of the licensing thing in Charleston, I read that there was another city, I think it was Williamsburg in Virginia, that they have now said, okay, licensing is not going to be mandatory because they'd seen this ruling that come up. Do you think that Charleston will win an appeal, or do you think we'll see other cities go, well, hang on, if it's been ruled unconstitutional, maybe we have to withdraw the licensing requirement as well?
I think what you'll see is the licensing will become voluntary, which is where things are headed in Charleston. So it'll essentially become a marketing issue. We are certified by the whatever organization as being quality tour guides. I think that's where it will go. And I think for me personally, I think that's probably the appropriate way to do it. Charleston is always slow to change things. So Charleston is never one to take change very easily. But that does seem to be the trend as far as the licensing requirements for tour guides goes, is that it becomes more of a self-policed type of thing as opposed to a city-controlled thing. And frankly, the cities, I don't know, do a very good job of it anyways, because the city itself is not in the tourism business and doesn't necessarily understand from the tour guide perspective what information is relevant and what is not in terms of giving tours. And, the tour guide test that we used to have to take was a 200 plus question written exam. And then you had to take an oral exam after that. And the city went back and redid the manual, which is about the size of a phone book that you have to study. And, some people have gone through it, and even the tour guide manual that's supposed to be the last word on the correct historical information has a lot of mistakes in it. So it was always an imperfect process.
Never miss an episode of the show. Subscribe at tourpreneur.com/subscribe.
Oh, well, that must be terrifying when you're starting out and they give you that big phone book, as you say, with 200 written questions and oral questions. I mean, that must be terrifying for a tour guide.
Yeah, it's a bit nerve-wracking, especially the oral. The worst part was the oral exam way back when, because they would put all of the prospective tour guides on a tour bus, and then a panel of senior tour guides you would drive around with them, and they would pull your name out of a hat. And wherever you happened to be, you had to go up to the front of the bus and give like a 2-minute tour of whatever was around you. So you had the fact that you're being judged by your peers, and you have no idea what you're going to have to talk about. And, it could be a street where you know absolutely nothing of interest. So that was really nerve-wracking process.
Wow. And is that something that you have to go through every year, or is it one and done? And
one and done, and then you have to take classes every 3 years to recertify.
It's a fascinating subject. And I think it's one that might revisit on a future episode of the show, because I really want to get into your story. But it's really fascinating to me to hear all the different licensing requirements around the world, because it does vary. If you could go back in time, is there anything that you would change when you started out on your own? Anything you would do differently?
Yes, I probably would have taken things. When I first started, my initial thought, because I was coming from a larger existing tour company that was sort of in the process of coming apart, my initial thought was to, as much as possible, replicate that tour company, and so that I could bring my fellow tour guides with me and continue giving tours that way. I think if I could go back, I would have probably just taken it a bit slower and focused more on just starting from scratch and building up, instead of trying to incorporate something that was already existing into this new company. Because what I did is in bringing in, I think I came in with too many different types of tours and probably too many employees for what we had at that point. And so that led to some problems later on. Because it's a new company, there wasn't enough business there to support all of these tours or all of these tour guides. And I had to downsize and sort of start over. And so, yeah, I think that would be one thing that I would have changed.
And that's something that you see often. I don't watch reality TV much. There's always ghost TV on in our house. Ghost stories and Bird Box and whatever it's called. I don't know. Kitchen Nightmares with Gordon Ramsay. That's one of the first things he often says to these struggling businesses is your menu is like a phone book. Do 10 things and do them really well and cut this menu down. I think a lot of us in tours kind of fall into that category sometimes of adding too much instead of being the specialist of a few. So I think that's really sound advice for anyone out there who is thinking of starting their own tour. What would you say is the best thing that's happened to you since you started your tours, Mike?
I would say the podcast certainly has been one of the best things. The podcast and the tour are sort of interconnected. So that's one thing that I've really enjoyed, is starting that show, the podcast, and having that be sort of a part of the tour. The thing I absolutely enjoy the most is when you just have a really good group of people that you really connect with. Mm-hmm. And it makes that tour such a wonderful experience. Sometimes you have these tours where you just don't want it to end.
Yeah.
You wish you could just hang out with these people for the whole weekend.
Yeah.
And those are the moments that I really look forward to more than anything.
I want to talk a bit more about your podcast a bit later in the show, because definitely that's something I want to learn more about. What would you say is the craziest thing you've seen in the business since you started up? I mean, you're a ghost guy. I'm sure you see lots of crazy things that go bump in the night. Do you want to share something with us?
Well, there's a particular location that we visit on the tour where people keep passing out. So it started in 2013, where there's this one gate to a graveyard that we go to, and someone fainted in front of the gate.
Now, this isn't one of those drunk tours that I've seen in New Orleans, right? This is Stone Cold Sober.
Yes. And it happened in 2013. I thought it was just an isolated incident. And then it didn't happen in 2014. And then in 2015, it happened 5 times in the same location. 4 times. 4 times. And then in 2016, it happened 6 times. And in 2017, it happened 6 times. And then last year it happened 3 times. So maybe we're trending down again. But yeah, it was just this one place where we would go there and people would have this reaction to it. That's one of the big weird things on the tour.
So as a tour guide, how do you deal with that? So first of all, you've got someone who's literally falling over, I guess.
Well, at first, but frankly, it happens so many times that I can usually tell it's getting ready to happen. And I'll just move everybody over to some steps and have them sit down because I don't want anybody to get hurt. But yeah, it happened enough to where I can see it coming and work around it now. But yeah.
So with your knowledge of ghosts and that world, what do you put that down to?
Well, it's one of the things that is often suggested is, that it's just sort of psychosomatic. It's people are reacting to the story that they're hearing or I guess overreacting to the story that they're hearing. And yet, having said that, on one occasion, I was standing adjacent to that place, and another tour group who's not listening to me and is not hearing about anybody fainting, somebody in that group fainted while we were standing there watching. So I don't, I just attribute it to this pretty creepy location.
Wow. It's fascinating. It's a whole different world for me, to be honest, because I've always been a bit of a cynic when it comes to this thing. But hearing that, wow, the unexplained.
Well, one of the things that I stress on the ghost tour is that I'm not out to convince anyone of anything. And that I always tell people that, because you get a lot of cynics on the tour, and I tell people, well, you don't have to believe in ghosts to enjoy ghost stories.
Sure.
And that's what you're here for, is to enjoy ghost stories. And, we'll see if some creepy stuff happens while you're hearing the ghost stories. But that's what I always try to emphasize.
Could you share a little bit more about, 10 years ago, you're leading your very first tour. What was it like?
I will tell you this. When I first became a ghost tour guide, this was in the late 1990s. It was a very much a sink or swim type of proposition. What you would do is your training consisted of following around another ghost tour guide and listening to them tell stories. And then after about 3 or 4 times of that, they would just say, okay, you're giving the next tour. And you would just get thrown into the deep end of the pool. And you just had to kind of, tough it out. That's not the way I do things, but that's how I was trained. So that was a bit of sort of a survival of the fittest type of way to learn how to give a tour. But that's, nowadays I put a lot more training into working with a lot more time into working with someone before I would ever have them give a tour. But of course, when I first started giving ghost tours, you didn't have online reviews. So that's also a big difference.
Well, I was looking at your reviews earlier on. You must be very proud of them, Mike. You have some fantastic reviews.
Well, you talk about things that you stress over and worry about. Reviews is certainly right up there at the top. So much of the business is driven by reviews nowadays. It's something that I always worry about, but it's also something that a lot of people struggle with.
Do you have any tips for any tourpreneurs listening in about how you manage, as much as you can, TripAdvisor reviews, how you solicit them?
Well, one thing that I would recommend is that you make sure that the quality of your tours is where you want it to be before you start to solicit reviews. Having a large quantity of people leaving reviews, if your tour is not up to snuff, is not going to do you any favors. I've seen companies that have perfected the art of getting people to leave reviews, but the tours are not necessarily really good, and so they end up getting a lot of bad reviews, and that ends up hurting them.
Really enjoyed listening to Jennifer, who was on episode 2, who leads hiking tours in Asheville. And it was, her tip was she used Meetup, and she just gave free tours, first of all, to kind of gauge local interest, but then B, to get the feedback. So she gave everybody a survey and got feedback on her tour, which I thought was a really good idea because she had actionable feedback before she went out and started charging for it. And then, of course, the reviews coming in. I thought that was an inspired way of doing things.
Yeah, when I first started pushing for reviews, I used Groupon, which I don't recommend Groupon necessarily now, but it was a way to get a lot of people on the tour and increase the pool of people. Because again, it's like with anything, for only a small percentage of the people that would come on your tour are going to leave you a review, a very small percentage. So you have to, the more people you have, the more reviews you're going to get. The problem with something like Groupon is that there also is this sort of perverse thing where the less someone pays for something, the more likely they are to be critical of it. And that certainly is true of tours as well. I would often find that the people using Groupons, when I would look at the reviews on Groupon, while they were still overwhelmingly positive, would often be more negative and critical than like TripAdvisor.
Yeah, no, this is definitely the same in the hotel industry as well. I wanted to ask you, at what point did you realize that, hey, I need some extra tour guides here?
When I was turning away people, when I found that I was turning away more people than I was taking out.
Yeah. And can you talk us through, your selection process, how you found, because like you're saying, right, that the reviews are going to come in, and if the tour is not a quality tour because of either, something the tour guide's done, that affects your business. So how do you go about, first of all, selecting tour guides? And then you talked earlier on about training them. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that.
A lot of times it was hard just to find somebody.
Oh, yes.
To begin with. And then the training process to give ghost tours for me would last generally a month to 2 months, depending on the tour guide. And I would pay them while they were training. So it was a very expensive proposition.
Yeah.
And it would involve basically teaching them how to tell ghost stories. And I would go through that step by step with them. And then basically what they would do, part of it would be the just one-on-one training. And then the other part of it would be them coming on my tour with me.
Right.
And at first they would be listening to me, and then they would get one story to tell on that tour. And then they would get, if they could tell that story well, then they would get 2 stories to tell on that tour. And so that sort of shared tour with me, that way they could gradually get used to it and work their way up to giving a tour by themselves.
No, that's fantastic that you put that much investment, time and money into training up tour guides. What tips would you have for tourpreneurs out there who've never recruited or never managed staff before?
Just be as selective as you can with hiring people. Make sure that they understand what's expected of them in terms of scheduling and how often they'll be working. And you just have to be patient with them in terms of training and getting them to where you want them to be. And when they inevitably, and understand that as much training as you give someone, everybody gets bad reviews sometimes. It's just part of the business. And you have to figure out what the point is, what your tolerance level is, and what is an acceptable amount of criticism for someone to receive versus what is something that indicates a problem.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of qualities are you looking for? So when you're interviewing someone, obviously no one's coming in with a degree in ghost stories, right? No, ghost tour guide. So what kind of qualities and skills are you looking for in a candidate?
Well, someone who can communicate well. Someone who is comfortable standing in front of a group of people and telling a story. And also someone who is willing to learn. Problem I found was that you had, for example, experienced tour guides who were quite comfortable talking in front of a group of people, but who were very resistant to learning anything new. And then you have new tour guides who have to get used to talking in front of people, but who are generally more willing to do things the way you want them done.
And that's quite a tricky quality to interview for, because everyone's going to say, "Oh yeah, I'm open to coaching." And
yes,
a lot of this is gut instinct. I think when we're interviewing, do you have any tips or tactics when you're interviewing to find out if they really are open to coaching?
I think a lot of times you just got to kind of go with your gut. You just got to talk to them and ask them some questions. And it's a lot of times I think it's just a feel.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 90% of it is a feel. I think another potential idea could be to give them an exercise of some sort and a very short story to tell you. And then potentially when they've done that is to give them some feedback. And then, the key question when I was interviewing salespeople was always, "Hey, how do you fancy doing that again?" And if people said no, then you knew they weren't the right person.
Well, that is something that I've done before, is I would say, just tell me a story. Tell me a story about anything. Doesn't matter what it is. Let me just see, what you telling a story sounds like. that's very helpful for gauging where they are versus where you're going to need them to be.
Yes. And then I think that the second bit of advice I would offer on that is if you hear the story and you say, hey, it would be better if you said this or did that, and then do you fancy running through it again? And have they listened to you? And it used to surprise me how many people I would interview that just didn't take, and I know it's an interview situation and everyone's nervous and anxious, but when people didn't use any of the feedback, then I would just say, yeah, I don't think they are open to coaching. And that'd be my own little way of, because you're right, you can have all the questions. There's no way you're going to really know until they do something practical, I think. And that's just, you're right. I hear this from tourpreneurs all the time. It is the number one quality. Well, number one quality is passion for the subject. And then secondly is being open to coaching, I think is so important.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's passion for the subject. And I don't even mean that you have to be just like, for example, with ghost stories, that you have to just be this absolute fanatic about ghost stories. But what is essential is that you have somebody that wants to be there.
Yes.
If there's one thing that I cannot absolutely not stand, it just drives me crazy, is having a tour guide working for me that shows up to give a tour and is rolling their eyes and is telling me, they basically rather be somewhere else.
Yeah.
And, sighing and that just makes me so angry. Because I would pay the people that work for me, I would pay them far above what they could expect to be paid working for another company. But I expected more from them in terms of the quality of their tour. And so what I found is that there are plenty of people that are willing to take the extra money, but getting them to deliver the extra effort, or in some cases, just the minimum effort is sometimes not easy.
And that was going to be my next question for you, Mike. So, it's tough to get good people. You bring someone in, they're coachable, you train them, you're really happy with them. Other than the dollars, how do you go about retaining them?
I don't know that I've had a lot of success with retaining them because a lot of times it's just, especially the tourism business, at least being a tour guide, is for a lot of people not certainly what they intend to be their career. Yeah. And so they move on to other jobs at some point. Sometimes people are willing to stay, but they're just not able to deliver the quality tour.
Sure.
And so you have to let them go. I would say that if somebody were asking me for advice on retaining employees, I would just say, make sure you pay them well, treat them well, but also be very clear about what you expect from them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good advice.
And you could sometimes you just have to, and then again, that's just one of those things you just have to accept. It's just the fact of life. People are going to move on. There's going to be turnover, and it's just part of the process.
Yeah.
Did you know every weekday Shane curates the most interesting news articles in tours and activities and sends them out in a snappy daily digest? Grab your copy of the Tourpreneur Daily Briefing at www.tourpreneur.com.
In terms of letting people go, I'm sure you've had to do that a few times. Do you have any tips? Because that's always very tough to do, isn't it?
Very tough, yeah. Especially, for example, in Charleston, the tour guide community is very small. So you're dealing with people that oftentimes are not only your employer or your employees, they're also your friends.
Right.
And they're people that you interact with socially and that you've known for a long time. So having to fire someone or lay someone off is a really, really horrible, stressful process.
And how do you deal with that?
I think you just have to bite the bullet and do it. It's one of those things. It's just, if it has to be done, it has to be done. And it's just better to do it and be done with it. I don't think anything good ever results from keeping someone that you should let go around just because you don't want to go through the discomfort of letting them go.
Yes.
Inevitably it just gets worse. And I think if you have to let someone go, let them go. I am a believer in giving someone second chances or even third chances and working with them to do whatever you can to try to turn things around. But if that just doesn't work, and sometimes it doesn't, then you got to do what you got to do.
Moving from management and people, let's talk a little bit how you got the word out about your tours. So maybe 10 years ago when you launched your own business, What did you do in terms of marketing to get the word out?
Well, even 10 years ago, at least in terms of walking tours, a lot of the emphasis was still on, printed rack cards and that sort of thing, and going around and talking to the concierges at the hotels. And that tended to be where most of the emphasis was when we started. But over the past 10 years, it's the preponderance of the marketing has shifted to online, obviously. And so it's become very much for me, my entire business is nowadays based on reviews. That's people choose me over one of my competitors because of the reviews.
Sure.
Occasionally I'll still get someone that sees the rack card and that kind of thing. But nowadays it's mostly the reviews for me. Though I recognize that's not the only way to do it. I mean, there's other companies that I compete with that, they have different people have different marketing advantages. One company has exclusive access to a graveyard, or another company, has an arrangement with people, timeshare companies on the tourist areas, so that their brochures and posters and whatnot are on display. So there are different ways to do it. My way is through the reviews.
How about your own website? And I'll have all the links to the websites on the show notes, which is tourpreneur.com/4. Did you go through search engine optimization training, or did you hire someone? How does that look for you, Mike?
Well, I work with a company that handles my website and my ticket sales and all of that. And they help me with, let's see what some Google AdWords do, or let's see what this other thing does and see how that works. I'm not a particularly proficient person when it comes to SEO or that kind of thing. So that's not my strength. And so I've tried to just find someone to help me with that.
Is it a local company you're working with, or a national one?
It's just a company. It's not like a big name company, but it's one that's just sort of helped me face websites. That's it.
Face
yes.
websites. Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of online reservations, do you work with a booking platform? How does that look for you?
No. It's all set up to do it through our website. Though I am approached by online booking platforms on almost a daily basis.
Is there any reason why you haven't gone with any of them?
Honestly, I'm just comfortable with the way things are set up. With the company that I use, it's like I'm on a first name basis with the person who runs the company. And if I have a problem, I can get in touch with them and they will take care of it. And it doesn't matter if it's a Saturday afternoon, they will take care of it. And you go to a bigger company, and I don't know that you get that level of service. Maybe you do, but I don't know.
Well, I have to wear an independent hat here because I don't want to be biased to any of them. But one thing we're trying to do with the show is the first two guests were using Fair Harbor, and they're very happy with Fair Harbor. But, I really want the guests to sell who they're working with. I don't want to do that for anybody because I've not worked with them. I know of them, but I haven't worked with them. And I want to try and keep the show as independent as I can. So, interesting on this one that you've gone with Face websites, and I will link to them on the show notes at tourpreneur.com/4. How are you managing your social media?
Well, most of my social media presence tends to be more along the lines of the podcast. Right. And the podcast is connected to the tour. Yeah. So I get a lot of people on the tour coming from the podcast.
And how did you first get into podcasting?
Well, at one point I had a group of employees working for me, and I was one of the things that I used to do when I would be driving down to give tours is I would listen to a paranormal radio show. And they had a thing called Supernatural News every Friday, where they would just talk about different weird news stories in different places. And what I found worked really well is that I would use those little news snippets to engage with people on my tour. So if there was a story from Indiana about a haunted house, and I had someone from Indiana on my tour, I would say, "Oh, have you heard of this haunted house?" And just share whatever I remembered from hearing about it on the show. And what I found was that was a really effective way to connect with people on the tour on a personal level. And it also made it seem like I knew a lot more than I actually did about, paranormal. So I tried to get the people that worked for me to do that too, not very successfully. And eventually I just decided, I kind of enjoy talking about these haunted places in other cities outside of Charleston. And I've been storytelling now for 20 years. And I wonder if I can, am I a good tour guide or am I a good storyteller? And I said, well, I'll try to do a podcast and see how that works. And the podcast has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it.
And I have to say this. So I took a little listen because obviously being a podcaster myself, I'm always curious in other podcasts. This isn't just you talking into a mic. The one I listened to, your production values were superb, Mike.
Well, that's because I record in a studio with a sound engineer. Because the podcast is connected to the tourism business, it needs to have a certain, I guess, level of professionalism to it, because it's in essence an advertisement for the tour. That's kind of one of the reasons I decided to do it the way that I did it, in terms of going to a studio and working with a sound engineer. Which makes it sound a lot better than I ever could if I were doing it on my own.
I was impressed because I know how difficult it is to get that crystal clear sound sometimes. Also, when you bring it in music and atmospherics on different tracks, I was impressed listening in to your show. I wanted to ask you, how do you connect the podcast to your tours? Do you run an ad, or do you mention the tours you're doing? How does that work?
Well, actually, and I probably should have done that, but I haven't done that yet. But mostly, there are certain episodes of the podcast that cover things that I cover on the tour itself. And just the fact that I give the tour, for people who like the podcast, it's in essence a live show. If they enjoy the podcast, then they can come and they can meet me and they can go with me on the tour and visit these creepy places, which is something that seems to appeal to fans of the show.
And what I will say, if there's any tourpreneurs listening in who are interested in starting podcast, by all means, feel free to drop me an email at tourpreneurshow@gmail.com. And I'm happy to send a few articles on how to get started. But I really like what you've done here, Mike. If you have the resources to go and get a pro to do it for you, there's nothing worse than having bad audio on a podcast, right, Mike? It's just the amount of podcasts I've stopped listening to because it's just scratchy audio.
Yes. And there's a learning curve to it. So if this were just a hobby for me, the podcast, then, that's no problem. But because there's a business component to it, I really felt the need to do it the way that I did it by going to a studio for it. But also the advantage of that, it really allows me to just focus on the story. And so I can put all my energy into whatever I'm going to talk about and not have to worry about everything else that goes into creating a podcast episode.
I like your approach here. And again, if you're bootstrapping, I know that this might seem a luxury to you, but if you can, with your website and your digital, you've outsourced it and said, I'm not the expert. I want someone else to do that. Same with the podcast, going to a studio. I mean, that's a luxury I would love to have, but you're investing in the areas where you're not strong and then spending all the time where you are strong. I think that's an important takeaway from today's chat with you, Mike, that it's so important to do that if you have the resources.
Want to connect with other tourpreneurs? Then join our Facebook group at tourpreneur.com/Facebook.
Thinking about productivity, are there any tools or apps that are indispensable to you in running your business?
For most people who go on my tour purchase their tickets through the website, probably 90-something%. For those that don't, the Square website has been a godsend. I still remember the Square app. I remember, lugging around an actual credit card machine in my backpack when I was giving tours. This like brick, for processing credit cards, which I hated. So now just having a little thing you can stick into your phone and process credit cards that way, it's so convenient. I love it. That's certainly something that helps a lot in terms of the business, the money side of it. We've already talked about, things like TripAdvisor in terms of the marketing aspect.
I'm curious, actually, in terms of the booking window for people booking your tours, what kind of booking window is it?
I leave it open right up till the start time of the tour.
How many people on average turn up for each of your tours?
Well, it just depends on the time of year. If we're in season, it's not uncommon for the tours to sell out, and the city limits us to 20 people per tour guide. So if it's out of season or it's just a slow night for whatever reason, generally I try to keep the minimum at about 4 people. You can have plenty of tours where you'll just have 4 or 5, 6 people on them sometimes.
And what about the split between international and domestic? How does that look for you?
Huge majority is domestic. You do get people from overseas on the tours, but they would be a relatively small percentage. And then even of the domestic people that come on the tour, certain states are certainly more represented than other states. That's one of my favorite things to do when I travel is to go on a ghost tour somewhere else. It's always interesting just to see how it works and be looking at it from the outside instead of the inside.
Excellent. Well, actually, that leads me on to the quick fire round. What was the last tour you experienced?
Well, the last tour that I went on was a tour of the Waverly Hills Sanitarium in Louisville, Kentucky, which is a famous haunted location in Louisville. It's like an old abandoned hospital. That was fun. And then the last ghost tour I went on walking ghost tour was in Salem, Massachusetts. I did a couple of ghost tours there, which I really enjoyed. And next week, I'm going to be going to do one in Savannah, which I'm looking forward to.
Oh, fantastic. That's another city on my list to visit. What would you say is your favorite all-time tour?
Well, I would say probably in Charleston, we have the Old City Jail, which is a location that I've done a podcast episode about. It's a place that I spent the night for the podcast.
Spent the night in a jail?
Alone in a haunted jail, yes.
This can't be quickfire. You've got to share this story with us now.
For an episode of the podcast, I got the idea that I would like to spend the night in this old haunted jail. And it ended up being, I'd assumed that the people who ran the jail would have someone stay with me, but they didn't. So I ended up spending the night alone in the old haunted jail, which I think I might be the first person to have done that. And it was quite an experience. But there's 2 episodes. Lots of things happened. Oh, yes. It was lots of slamming doors and voices and all kinds of weird things happened in that night.
Whoa.
It was very intense.
Yeah, I can imagine. What was the episode number of that show?
I don't recall the episode number, but the episode is called Condemned. It's a 2-part episode.
I'll find this, guys, and I will add it to the show notes at tourpreneur.com/4, because otherwise we're going to spend the next half an hour talking about the jail. And I want you to go and listen to Mike's podcast. Moving on from that, what is your favorite holiday destination?
So far, the place that I've enjoyed the most was Salem, Massachusetts.
And why is that?
I just love it. It's one of the things, it's like, it's similar to Charleston in the sense that it's small enough that you can walk everywhere. You don't really need a car. And I love the history, and I love it has sort of this creepy edge to it, especially Salem with the witch trials and everything. For me, it was just the perfect destination.
Which famous person would you most like to have dinner with?
Probably Stephen King.
Makes sense. What would you think your first question would be to Stephen King?
I would just want to talk to him about how he tells stories. Which is, I think that I would love to hear him talk about, someone who's so well recognized as being sort of the master of telling scary stories. What an opportunity that would be to talk to someone like that about something that I try to do on a nightly basis. That would be a real privilege.
What would you do if you're taking your tour one night and there he is, he's on your tour?
Well, I think that would just be absolutely nerve-wracking. I don't know that I would be able to think clearly for the duration of that tour. I remember years ago giving an architecture tour and then having a group of architects come on the tour. And it was extremely stressful.
What is your favorite museum or attraction?
I think my favorite museum, and this is obviously bias on my part, would be the Charleston Museum. I just love it. I've loved it since I was a child.
What do you like to read when you're on holiday? Ghost stories, right?
Yeah, I'm always reading. I'm always reading history, and I'm always looking for some interesting, creepy historical story. I don't think that part of my brain ever really turns off.
What are the essential items you always take with you on a trip?
Well, I'm the kind of person that I always want to have something to read. So I always make sure that I have, in the old days, I would always make sure I had a book with me, like a paperback or something. Nowadays with your phone, you can pretty much have anything you want with you all the time. So I always want to make sure that I have something to read or podcast to listen to or something like that. I person that doesn't like being bored, sort of stuck with nothing to do.
And as we wrap up here, can you share with us what is your top travel tip?
The thing that I always mess up on when I travel is I never seem to figure out the right amount of clothes to take with me. I don't know if that's really travel business related, but I'm not very good at packing for when I travel. So I have to let my wife kind of handle that for me. But because if I left to my own devices, I will inevitably, not do a good job of it. But I would say certainly in tourism, and especially with something like ghost tours, is that you want to double check, obviously make reservations ahead of time, double check that the company the tour is going to go out. And especially if you're reading reviews of a company, and especially if it's a larger company, I would inquire as to who your tour guide would be and if you can request a particular tour guide. Because a lot of times especially with ghost tours, that makes all the difference in the world. It's not a question of whether one company is better than another company. It's a question of which tour guide you get.
That's very good advice. And who would you like us to interview next on Tourpreneur?
I would say somebody that's running maybe like a smaller museum somewhere, or maybe a private house house tour or something. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's wonderful to talk to, this business, this industry is just so diverse. It's what puts fire in my belly. Mike Brown of Pleasing Terrors, Ghost Tour and podcast. Thank you very much for joining us on tourpreneur.com/4.
Thank you for having me.
Wow. So much knowledge there for us tourpreneurs. I am so grateful to Mike and all of our guests who give us some of their valuable time to share their experience, knowledge, and learnings with us. If you enjoyed today's show, please help me get the word out about Tourpreneur and consider sharing it with your network in the industry. Next time on Tourpreneur, we interview a man who runs World War II tours in the Netherlands. That's right, we're crossing the pond. And this is the beauty of what we're trying to do here on the show. Maybe you aren't that interested in hiking, ghost tours, World War II tours. But in each of these conversations, we share actual learnings from fellow tourpreneurs. Advice that maybe you can implement in your business and improve your revenues, increase your customer satisfaction. Until then, tourpreneurs, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Tourpreneur podcast. Be sure to visit tourpreneur.com to join the conversation and access the show notes, including links to the resources mentioned on today's episode. This is Tourpreneur.